Well, so I I always I always hate it whenever someone uses the phrase, well, to be honest. Well, shouldn't we always kind of be honest, right? But to be honest, let me talk about this week and kind of preparing for this sermon. So sermon prep is always kind of challenging, right? Especially in this setting. I've come to really appreciate there are certain denominations and things that will have a lectionary, which so the denomination itself produces that, and it kind of takes you through the whole Bible, and it gives you scripture readings and everything. Those are really helpful, and I use those as resources at times anyway. But it's kind of nice because it can be, well, what am I going to preach on this week? And you go, well, what does the lectionary say? And you just go there. That's a wonderful tool. I usually don't do that, and so I was kind of struggling with what direction to go, and so I decided, well, we were in Genesis, and especially talking about the creation account, and spent a lot of times there, and so I was like, I want to go back into Genesis, and we're going to start moving through really quickly because we could be here for years just going through the beginning, but I think it's important for us to kind of remember and to relearn sometimes kind of the basis and the foundation of our faith, right? Of understanding who God is, understanding what God is all about, and just being reminded of that, and sometimes maybe encountering new truths and things that maybe we struggle with, and we're going to see some of that. This is all going to kind of move towards, I want to go through the foundation of the people of Israel to kind of God giving the law, and then go from there to looking at Jesus' application of that law. And so this is going to be obviously a long process. This isn't going to happen, in the month of January, but that's kind of the direction we're going. And so today we're going to look in Genesis. We're going to be in chapter 6, and we're doing the traditional story of Noah and the ark, right? And if you know anything about this story and how it has impacted churches, all you have to do is go into the nursery area of most churches, and you're going to have a Noah's Ark theme, right? Because it's a great theme, and it's an easy theme to do. You have animals, and they're 2 by 2, and they're all happy, and you don't really think about how the fact that a bunch of people are about to drown, and it's this interesting relationship, right? Sometimes we have see these stories through children's eyes, and that's an okay thing, but we also need to recognize, wait, that's probably not the point of the story, right? And so we're going to look at this, and again, I want to just remind you that when we're looking at Genesis, especially the first 12 chapters of Genesis before Abraham, that's kind of considered prehistory, right? Like there's not really a historical record at this time. We don't really even know when this is. This doesn't, the Bible is very historically accurate. And once Abraham hits, there starts to be cities and places that we can actually archaeologically say, oh yeah, that's what this is talking about then, and this fits in this time period. Before that, there's not really much of that at all. And that's okay, because, humanity was very early, but these were common stories. These were common things that were used as teaching tools by the people. And so this early part of Genesis would have all been orally taught over and over and over again, right? And then it would have been kind of put together by the time that Moses gets around. So it's tough for us. It's hard for us to read something that is literally talking about things that happened 9,000 years ago, probably at least, right? And we don't really know it, and it's a tough thing. And the flood narrative, sometimes we get bogged down. Like we get bogged down into, you start reading through Genesis, and it talks about people living to be 900 years old. And we're like, what's going on, right? And the answer is, well, we don't really know. right? I'm okay with it being literally people lived to be 900 years old at that time. But I'm also okay with that being representative of something else. That's the time was calculated differently. I'm okay with that as well. But at the time of when Noah comes on the scene, God clearly says, okay, we're starting to limit this. And maybe he's decided to start limiting it because human beings were being so awful. And wouldn't it be nice to know that someone that is really awful isn't going to be around for 1,000 years? Right? But you see that, and so we're going to enter into this flood story, the story of Noah and the ark. And I don't want us to get caught up in a lot of it. I want us to make sure we see the major overarching principle, which is a very tough principle, by the way, and one that we're probably uncomfortable with. So let's dive in. We're going to start in Genesis chapter 6, starting in verse 5. It says, "The Lord saw how the wickedness of the human race had become on earth, and that every inclination of the thoughts of the human heart was only evil all the time. The Lord regretted that he had made human beings on earth, and his heart was deeply troubled. So the Lord said, I will wipe from the face of the earth the human race I have created, and with them the animals, birds, creatures that move along the ground, for I regret that I have made them. But Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord." This is the account of Noah and his family. Noah was a righteous man, blameless among the people of this time, and he walked faithfully with God. Noah had 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Now the earth was corrupt in God's sight and was full of violence. God saw how corrupt the earth had become, for all the people on earth had corrupted their ways. So God said to Noah, I'm going to put an end to all the people, for the earth is filled with violence. Because of them, I'm surely going to destroy both them and the earth. All right, we're going to stop there. We're not going to read the whole account, because you know that at this point, God gives Noah the instructions of how to build an ark. It goes through that process of bringing in the animals to save creation, to basically start again. But this is the beginning. Now, there's some things that's important. There, pretty much every ancient civilization that fits kind of this timeline had flood stories and flood myths. All right, just about all of them. And they all involved the god, and in the other cases, the pagan god, destroying the world and flooding the earth, right? Probably because they had experienced massive floods, probably because they knew at some point that there had been a flood that had flooded everywhere, right? And so there's these myths that are coming up of why did this happen? How did this happen? But there's some very distinct differences, just like there's some very distinct differences between the creation account in Genesis and other creation accounts from pagan societies. There's some very big distinctions of the flood story. They all would have an individual or an individual family that would be saved, right? But it's interesting, you look at the other stories, it was because the person was good looking, right? That's one of the reasons given that they were saved. You know, I'd like to think that I'd be that one person, but I'd probably be drowning with everyone else. You know, another was that they were wealthy, so they were saved because they were wealthy. And then a third that you'll see is that they were half God, which that's another thing. And I'm not getting off on this tangent, but real quick. One thing that was very common in that time is this belief that the gods would come and be with people, right? One of the things that you see with Noah is that's a major problem, right? So and that's really hard for us. We don't understand what it says, the sons of God and the daughters of Eve and all this stuff. But basically it's saying that is not supposed to happen, right? It's a bad thing. These other myths, they were not saying that. They were saying, this is just a normal thing. The gods come down, they mess with us, they leave their offspring, and sometimes there's half human, half gods, right? And so those are the 3 types of individuals that would be spared the flood. Very different in the Bible. Why is Noah spared? Is it because he's good looking? I don't think so. I don't know. but I don't think so. Is it because he's wealthy? No indication of that. Is it because he's a half God? Definitely no indication of that. It's because he was righteous. It's because he strove to live the way that God wanted to live. He was trying to be good in an evil world. That was it, right? And interestingly, if anyone else would have fit that, they would have been saved too, right? But humanity had gotten to that point, and this is a kind of a theme throughout, especially this verse. If you look at Genesis in a big picture, what happens is God creates the Garden of Eden, and Adam and Eve and God are there. Everything is perfect. Everything is good. And then humans start to make their own choices, and they choose what? They choose the knowledge of good and evil, and they start moving away. And so Genesis starts off here, and then the rest of it is about people moving away from not only the Garden of Eden, but they're moving away from God. And they are choosing more and more to do their own thing, which leads to doing very evil things, right? And so we see that throughout Genesis. It's just kind of this just moving away from God. Also, one of the common things that we see is that in pagan myths of the flood is that they would give a reason for why God did this. And they were very interesting reasons. They were all very selfish. The most common, or the Gilgamesh, and if you Google that, that's a pretty popular pagan myth and flood. The god there, the reason that he decided that he was going to flood the earth is because humans were being too loud and he couldn't sleep. All right? So it's like, I'm done with you, right? But there's lots that are kind of along that, right? It's just that the God kind of got tired of them, right? And the guy and they were annoying him, so it was like, you know what? I'm just going to wipe you away. The reason that God floods the earth is very different. It is strictly a moral issue. It is a good and evil issue. It is God saying, I am not going to put up with this kind of evil because I am good, right? And this is not done out of anger. It's very interesting. One of the criticisms that, kind of has become popular is that, the God of the Old Testament, he's this angry God. And look at and I've heard the flood example, the story of Noah, as an example that God is an angry God. But if you read right there, it says that God regretted that he had made human beings, and his heart was deeply troubled. That's actually, his heart was deeply saddened. His heart is breaking, right? Because here's the creation that he loved, that he gave the ability to choose between good and evil, and they have completely chosen evil. They have completely turned their back on him. And he's seen the ugliness that does. And it's hard, because again, we say, well, why would you just kill everyone? Why would you just wipe everyone out? It's because of what evil does. It is ugly, and it constantly is hurting other people. That's the kind of evil we're looking at here. And I don't want to get into different levels of sin and all of that, but we're not talking about people were just kind of, bullying each other, and, they were just kind of saying mean things, right? There was no value for life. People were wicked. We're talking about a deep hatred of other people, right? And God sees that, and he looks and he says, look at the destruction that they're already doing, right? And so whenever we compare that to what God does in the flood, we kind of understand a little bit. Still, we should wrestle with this, I understand. But what this is showing is that we serve a God who recognizes that there is good and evil, and we serve a God who is good and despises evil. We don't serve a pagan God who chooses who to like based on how they look, how much money they have, or anything else. We have a God who recognizes the importance of us being righteous. He desires that. So the flood happens. We know kind of the basic story, right? Noah and his family entered into the ark, God shuts the door. They float for a 40, or it rains for 40 days, and they float. Then they run aground, and then God sends the wind to push back the waters. This is, again, that's such a simple thing, but that's actually very distinctive from other pagan myths. In many of the other pagan myths, the gods kind of unleash the flood, and then they can't stop it. Like it's, nature takes over, and they're overwhelmed by it. In some of them, they try to stop it, and they can't, right? Here, there's a reminder, no, God is above nature, right? The floodwaters, the weather is very powerful, but it is not above God. God controls it. And so God decides and starts clearing things off, and then you have Noah and his family that they come out of the ark, and they build an altar. So this is chapter 8, starting in verse 20. It says, "Then Noah built an altar to the Lord, and taking some of all the clean animals and clean birds, he sacrificed burnt offerings on it. The Lord smelled the pleasing aroma and said in his heart, 'Never again will I curse the ground because of humans, even though,'" and this is tough, and this is what we're going to be wrestling with, "'even though every inclination of the human heart is evil from childhood. And never again will I destroy all living creatures as I have done. As long as the earth endures, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night will never cease." All right, so this really is getting down to the point of Noah and the ark. It's a moral issue. It's talking about good and evil. And the question is, are people basically good or basically evil? All right? Now, there's so much that goes into this. And when we use the term evil, that's a tough one. Because, maybe are people basically good or basically bad? The problem is that the bad leads to evil, right? But there's different ways that theologically we have approached this. And it's a tough thing because no one wants to think of someone as being basically bad, right? And I think that we should approach in a practical way, I think we should approach people as if they are basically good, right? However, there's something, and this is, again, there's a lot of theological stuff going into this, but let's flesh this out a little bit. It wasn't really until the probably 1700s that people even considered that humans could be basically good, right? That's because in certain areas, society had started to become more civilized and things like that, and they started to think that way. Before that, it was kind of understood, yeah, most people it kind of may not be all that great, right? But this is a relatively new thing, looking and saying, no, people are basically good. Which what that means in practice is most people, if you just don't do anything, if they are born and they start, that they'll basically choose to do the right thing. That's what saying people are basically good means, right? That most people, just given, take away circumstances, stuff like that, they'll choose to do the right thing. I have tended to believe this or wanted to believe this. I don't think it's fully true. All right, now let's be careful here. It's not, theologically you may have heard of the term the total depravity of man, that we're born and that we're just evil and just horrible people. I don't believe that. I believe that all of us were created with the capacity to do good and with the capacity to do bad or to do evil, right? And human nature, on its own, we will tend to choose to do the bad. Now, it may not start with actually hurting other people, but it easily gets to that point. And this is not a person of faith. It's James Wilson. He's at Harvard. He's a UCLA political scientist. This is an interesting quote just from looking at some of his studies. He says, the forces that may easily drive people to break the law, a desire for food, sex, wealth, self-preservation, seem to be instinctive, not learned, while those that restrain our appetites, self-control, sympathy, a sense of fairness, seem to be learned and not instinctive. Right? So what he's saying, and he's not coming from a place of faith, is that, man, unfortunately, if you just leave people to their own desires, many times what they're going to choose is what is best for them. Right? That's part of it. And that can lead to things that are really, really bad. Right? And I think we need to really wrestle with this idea and struggle with it a little bit. You know, and I started thinking about that question. Are humans kind of inherently good or bad, or basically good or bad? And, you know, unfortunately, history tells us that, man, humans can kind of be pretty bad. Right? The 20th century, the 1900s, is one of the most deadly century, or it's the deadliest century in the history of the world, and the most civilized. Here's some of the basic things that have happened in the 1900s. And during the Holocaust, 6 to 8 million people were exterminated. Right? Quick side note, the Nazis actually passed a law that you could not do medical experiments on animals, and they protected animals while they were doing medical experiments on Jews. What? Oh my gosh, how is that possible, right? This is not that far ago, right? Stalin, during his reign in communist Soviet Union, between 20 and 30 million people lost their lives one way or the other. Many direct, many a result of starvation and famines that were caused by economic systems and things. In Cambodia, during that massacre, a third of the population of Cambodia was wiped out. What? In Ukraine, 4 to 6 million people were killed in Ukraine due to famines that were started by the Soviet Union. The communist China under Mao, right? And again, this wasn't that long ago. It's hard to know for sure, but they estimate that it could be up to 60 million people starved under that regime. Unbelievable. If you remember in Africa, the Hutus murdered they estimate between 500,000 to 1 million Tutsis in Rwanda. That was in a period of 100 days. If you look at Turkey, there was the Turkish genocide of Armenia, which many Christians were killed during that time. All of this happened in the 1900s. Right? Now, this is a little depressing. I understand. But there's something important that we need to understand, because we think, oh, it would never get to that. I would never get to that place. But you know, if we believe that everyone is basically good, then sometimes we're not intentional enough about teaching people to be good, right? We need to do that. See, here's some of the unintended consequences, if you will, if we don't kind of come from a place that says, okay, humans were created by God with the capacity for good and capacity for evil. But what we have shown as humans, we will drift to the side of evil, right? It starts off innocent. It starts off just making selfish choices, but it can easily grow beyond that, right? And so we need to have a moral system in place, right? That is so important. And if we buy into fully to the idea that humans are all basically good, what it does subtly is that we don't teach our children to be good, right? If you believe, oh, my child is going to be basically good anyway, then maybe you slack off on teaching them, no, this is what is right and this is what is wrong, right? And we've seen that, and it's this is not easy. Please understand that. But there are those who would say, no, I'm never going to tell my child no. I understand where that premise is coming from, but you know what? No, we need to teach our children this is right and this is wrong. And by the way, our children, what is their default? It's to kind of be a pain in your rear, right? Most of our children's default is not to listen to us and to do what they're asked to do and to be nice to people, right? And to share their stuff with children. Now, by the way, again, this is where this term evil, we have to be really careful. That's not them being evil. That's them being selfish. That's them giving into that human nature that moves us to be selfish, which is why it is so wonderful that we have a God who is good, who is loving, who forgives us of that, but also teaches us, no, this is the better way to live. Not giving in to that. To actually recognizing there is good and that there is evil, right? That there is good and that there is bad. I would much rather my children have much more self-control than self-esteem, right? Now, I think you can have both, right? But I'm not going to tell my children that everything that they do is okay so that they'll feel better about themselves. Because guess what? It's not, right? I don't want my kids to get good grades as much as I want them to be good people, right? And again, this is subtle, but if we do buy into the idea that everyone is just basically good and that they're going to make good choices, and we slack off on teaching that, man, it doesn't work out well. Another thing that the consequence to believing that humanity is basically good is that there becomes really no reason for God or faith. Why do you need God? Why do you need a faith structure if everyone is basically going to be good? Well, you really don't, right? One of the reasons for God and what God was doing is he was entering into this world and he was telling people, no, there is a structure, there is a faith that you need to follow because it makes a difference, right? It can help you. We can learn to make sure we choose to be good rather than choose to be selfish and do what we want, which ultimately leads us farther and farther and farther from God. And then all of a sudden, people are making decisions like that led to some of these things we talked about, right? Another consequence that happens is that we start blaming society rather than individuals, right? Now this gets real, and I'm not going to go into this real deeply, but if you believe that everyone is basically good, then if people are bad, well, it can't be their fault. It must be their environment's fault, all right? Sometimes the environment obviously environment. In fact, there's really interesting whenever it talks about Noah, and it says in his age, in his time, he was righteous in his time. What many have taken that to believe is that in spite of his surroundings, in spite of all the wickedness going on around him, he was choosing to be righteous, which is why it was impressive, why Noah was impressive, is because everyone else was doing what they wanted, right? And so obviously, our circumstances around us make a difference. Society, how you were raised, all of that impacts you. But we have to be careful, because if we get to the point where we think that, hey, if we just get society right, then that'll fix all of these problems. It doesn't, right? There's kind of a semi-myth out there that says people in poverty, that they are the ones that commit the most crimes. It's actually not true. They commit crimes. They don't commit violent crimes, right? And when you fix poverty, it doesn't necessarily change crime, right? The sermon today is one that I struggle with because I want us to see the good in everyone, and I think we should. And this is not preaching against that, because God created everyone, and he created all of us with the capacity to be good, and he also gave us the capacity to choose to be selfish and to walk away. And you know what? That's the sin nature. And that's where people will go if they don't hold on to faith. And we struggle with this because we have all grown up in a place and in a situation where most people are good, right? They're not perfect, but most people don't want to kill you. Like, they value your life. But what we're talking about here in the 1900s is that society gets to a place where people literally do not value your life. And that's a big jump, right? So we need to understand there is good, there is evil. And I am so thankful that we have a God who cares, and a God whose heart is broken when he sees the effects of evil and what it does in the world that he created. In a world that when he created it, he said, this is good. This is very good. I want to encourage you to wrestle with that a little bit. Not to be all depressed and not to start seeing everyone as bad, but recognizing the importance of faith and importance of living our life for God, because without that, we can easily spiral out to something that becomes really ugly. And that's what our culture is doing a really good job of right now, is pushing the need for God away. We need to be reminded in our households that no, we are going to live according to the good and the evil that God has laid out there. And we're going to live the way that he has called us to live in the face of the evil that is all around us. Let's go to him in prayer.